Hello, and welcome to Psych Incubator, a product of Strategic Psychotherapeutics. I am very pleased this evening to have as our guest Dr. Lenore Walker. She has been a pioneer in studying the psychological impact of interpersonal violence and trauma. She began her early work when she was on the faculty at Rutgers Medical School at the University of Medicine and Dentistry in New Jersey in the early 1970s. And as an early feminist psychologist studying child abuse and battered women, she conducted seminal research with battered women syndrome and helped introduce it into the courts in the US and around the world. In the 80s, it was her work on battered women syndrome that helped battered women who killed their abusive partners in self-defense get that testimony admitted in criminal trials. So later, she modified it to assist those with battered women syndrome in civil and custody cases, and then for sex trafficking and rape victims. She has been involved with the American Psychological Association and the governance, has helped formulate policies on various forms of gender violence there. So there's much more I could say about Dr. Walker. She is also a novelist. I have had the pleasure of recently reading her novel, From Murder to Madness, which I could not put down. And so, Dr. Walker, I am very pleased to have some time with you tonight to hear about your career, your work, and what you're involved in now. So why don't we start with just telling us how you got into this field and what it led you to working with these very challenging populations that you've spent so much time and your emotional energy working with.
Sure. I'm pleased to be here to share a little bit about some of what we've been doing. You know, I started thinking I was going to be a school teacher because back in those days, that's what women were told to do. In fact, I remember in my family, I remember my aunt saying to me, you know, you need an insurance policy just in case your husband is not going to make it and he might die before you or leave you or something. And I mean, first of all, why did I have to have a husband? I wasn't quite sure about that. But you know, that was what I grew up believing. So I went to Hunter College, and that was never a question in my family. Girls as well as boys were going to college. You know, I mean, I don't ever remember a time thinking that I had a choice. Now I had a choice about where to go. And so I ended up going to Hunter College because I grew up in New York City. And I came from a very working class family where there wasn't a sufficient amount of money to go out of state. And of course, in those days, the city colleges were free. And so I had the most wonderful education, paying very little money for it. So I went to Hunter, and at Hunter College, you could not major in education. You had a minor in it, and you had to pick a topic, a subject area. And I picked psychology, and I fell in love with psychology. And from that moment on, I knew that was what I was going to do. So I sort of compromised.
Do you remember what the spark was that got your passion in psychology lighted up? Like what when you think back to that time at Hunter, what was it that you experienced or learned that just kind of thought, wow, this is what I want to spend my life learning about and doing?
I just loved figuring out people's behavior. Why did they do what they did? And I started sort of blending what I had thought I was going to be. And that was, I started working as at first as a school psychologist. So I got my teaching degree. I worked in the schools. Then along came my starting to deal with some of the emotionally disturbed children. And so I started working with how do you get educators to work with emotionally disturbed children. And I loved working as a consultant in the schools, but they didn't want to hear what I had to say.
What
because
was it that you had to say that they didn't want to hear?
I had to say that it was their responsibility to work with these kids. And if they tried to see what each child needed, they would probably be able to calm down the emotional behavioral problems, because kids really want to learn. They really want to be successful. They want to feel competent. But many children won't learn in the way that the average child might learn. And so that was my message. But in those days, they had 30 and 40 kids in a classroom, and they didn't have time to think about that. So I did some work with, at that time I was still in New York, I did some work with Coney Island Hospital, where they had some fascinating programs that on trying to prevent children from getting more emotionally disturbed than they already were. And it was very much part of competency-based training. And so I was trying to teach teachers how to reach these children. And I loved that kind of work. But it was outside of the schools. I then had my own children, and I moved to New Jersey, where I could not, I had to have more. I had already gotten a master's degree at City College of the city.
And that was in school psych?
In school psych.
Yeah.
So I went back, I moved to New Jersey, and I went to Rutgers. And at Rutgers, there was a school psych program. And so I went into that program, and I loved the program. It was a fabulous learning how to really reach people in a positive way. And again, a kind of preventive mental health by competency building. And so I did that. And at that point, was back in the 1960s and 70s, when they were just beginning to insist that mental health centers would have preventive mental health programs in them. And so I was hired by Rutgers Medical School to teach in their community mental health center. And I worked there in building a preventive mental health program for I think there were 7 or 8 or 9, I'm not sure how many, school districts, because, you know, New Jersey has very small school districts. And I worked with, I had a whole staff of I think I don't remember, but I think about 5 people that spent half their time in the schools and half their time back at the mental health center. And we worked on a lot of the same kinds of programs I had been doing in New York City, which were a lot of fun. And this is after I got my doctorate. So that was, it was like a dream job for me. But my marriage wasn't doing so well. And I got divorced from my husband and met my second husband, who lived in Denver, Colorado. And so I picked up my 2 kids, who were then 5 and 9 and I think 5 and 8 years old or something like that. And we moved to Denver. And there I went on the faculty and just became a college teacher at Colorado Women's College. So I worked there. And that was when I first got interested in battered women syndrome.
What was it that interested you in battered women syndrome, and how did you come up with that terminology that explains that so well, that phenomena?
You know, it wasn't when I moved to Denver. It was before. It was while I was still at Rutgers Medical School, and there I was one of the few people who called themselves a feminist psychologist. There were plenty of feminist psychologists out there, but they didn't know it at the time, or they didn't say that they were. And this is 1970. I was at Rutgers from like in the early 1970s. And so I would get patients that would be referred to me, and because I was doing a lot of child psychology work, and the mothers were being blamed for all the children's problems. We never saw the fathers. And so I started trying to figure out with my patients, why aren't we seeing the fathers? And
well, we never have a negative influence on our children, or as
many of them
fathers.
told me that they were being abused.
Yeah.
Now I grew up in a family that was very noisy ethnic family, but there was no violence in that family. So for me, it was very surprising. And I got very interested in it. And I was starting to read about Erin Pizzey, who was a woman in London who really started the first battered women's shelter. I was fascinated.
Really?
With it. And
Uh-huh.
when I moved to Denver, my congresswoman was Patricia Schroeder,
Uh-huh.
who was fabulous. And I don't know how to explain moving from the New York City area, where you don't ever get to see your congresspeople except maybe on television or fleeting glance. Pat Schroeder was so accessible in Denver, Colorado. In those days, it was small. People knew one another. And so Pat said to me, and there was also, in the 1970s was the first time we dealt with child abuse. We didn't have child abuse laws until then. And it's hard to believe, but
It is.
But so Pat was very supportive and said to me, well, why don't you want to go to London and see what they're doing there? She said, I can make those arrangements for you. And so off I went. I was like a 30-something-year-old person at that point, representing my government in London. With one of my fun memories is I was at the offices of somebody who she had referred me to. His name was Nigel, and he had this big long mustache that some of the was in the style in those days. And we're sitting there, and in somebody wheels a cart with bottles of sherry and 2 glasses and an American flag and a British flag. They poured the sherry, and we toasted to the Queen, and we toasted to the president at that time.
Oh.
So it was very uplifting and fun time. And they took me all over England to see the different battered women's shelters that the National Federation of AIDS and Battered Women developed, and that were developed by Pizzey. And I came back to the United States, and at that point, we were just starting to do some minor kinds of grants in trying to look at developing shelters here in the United States. And so,
and were you seeing these women also clinically at all, or was it?
Well, a few, but that's one of the nice things about being trained initially as a school psychologist. So much of my training was in consultation and developing programs. And so I was spending a lot more time doing that, even though I had a small practice. So in Colorado, I got a position at Colorado Women's College, as I mentioned, and there I wrote a grant to the National Institute of Mental Health to
By yourself?
Battered women, by myself.
By yourself, wow.
By myself.
You were out there alone.
Yeah, I was.
This is Michael Alpert just joined us, and I don't know if
Hi,
you two have met,
Michael.
but welcome, Michael.
No, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm not commenting partly because of embarrassment of being late, but also because mostly everything you're saying is just setting off so many thoughts and ideas because, it's like the lid that was on all of this was on so tight. And obviously we were miles behind the British on this, but you just didn't report these things. You did, it didn't happen, even though it was everywhere.
That's so true. But we were ahead of the Brits in studying rape and the impact of rape on women's lives.
Really.
So when you put the two together, it became clear that we're dealing with gender violence. We're not just dealing with it being isolated. And there were a number of mostly women, some men who were involved, but such wonderful people that I worked with in the beginning. So even though the grant was my own, I got $250,000 from the National Institute of Mental Health as a first-time researcher.
And I know what that's like because we put a grant in a year and a half ago, and it was an enormous amount of work, and probably one of the most frustrating things I've ever done in my professional career. I felt like I got an MPH doing that grant. Unfortunately, we wasn't accepted, but that is an amazing feat, Lenore.
Well, at the same time, Jeff, I was able to get a book contract with Harper and Row at that time. Now it's HarperCollins, to write a book about my experiences. So in 1978, I get the book contract and an NIMH grant.
Wow.
Amazing. That I didn't, didn't have any idea how unusual that was.
So what was the book, that book contract?
And that was it was called The Battered Woman. And it
was that an edited volume or was that a single?
No, that was my first book. And it was just about all the stories that I was gathering from women, because I went around interviewing women who said that they were abused. And that's where I started to, today, what do we call it? Qualitative research.
Yes,
I was looking for the themes. We didn't have the words at that time, but that's basically what I was doing.
Yes.
Taking the stories and looking for what I saw psychologically, and then put it, that's when I said, well, I think that there's a syndrome there. Let's test it. I also used some of Seligman's theories at that time. Marty Seligman was talking more about learned helplessness.
Yes.
And I liked the concept, because if you could learn that what you normally expected to make a difference it didn't have that contingency between response and outcome, then you could change that. And so I studied that part as well. And that's when I developed the psychotheory, that you don't get abused all the time. I mean, if we were being battered all the time, women would not put up with it and would somehow find a way to get out. But that there was a lot of positives in those relationships and a lot of loving behavior. And I thought it came to the cycle, but I wanted to measure that. So those were my two theoretical constructs that I went to NIMH with, and they were very excited about funding it.
So would you just interrupt you a minute here? So would you say that, like, we've been working on a module on learning principles and behavioral principles, and would you say that is because it's on an intermittent schedule of reinforcement, that which is very hard to extinguish if you only get abused occasionally and you get treated lovingly. Those are the hardest contingency paradigms to.
Precisely.
And are there other, would you say there are
But
other
there's an overlay.
lenses?
Yes.
So what other lens do you look at that phenomena of the abuser, and like how do you what's your perspective on that dynamic?
Well, the overlay on that is the fact that women, it's our social construct of women and men, with women having less power and fewer resources than men. And so what we're really, that's the feminist overlay about the power dynamics that really played, in my mind, played an enormous role in how people stayed in those relationships. So we had the learned helplessness, which occurred over time, the ability to leave, which needed more resources than women actually had accessible to them, because where were they going to go? And the belief, just like in my own family, that, you were going to have a husband, maybe not for your whole life, but you certainly were going to start out with one. And you put all of that together, those were the dynamics that sort of went through my conceptualizations. And I haven't really changed them that much. I've added lots of details to it. But I still believe that power and control is very much part of domestic violence relationships or intimate partner relationships. The vocabulary changes over time. I don't want to change it, but other people do.
Why do you think there is still so much resistance to seeing how this operates, and particularly how many women still are not feminists and actually support the structure as a structure that has been so destructive to them and their children?
Well, I don't think women can do it themselves. I think, like anything, change is hard for all of us, for both men and women. And I think there's a huge pushback. In psychology, we have Division 51, which has been a very pro-feminist division, the people who founded it and who have been involved with it. And they're getting tremendous pushback from men who are saying, Ron Levant, for example, who was my dean for a while at Nova, developed a theory of toxic masculinity. Makes a lot of sense. And showed with data that men who engaged in that kind of behavior lived less, they shorter lifespan. But yet men don't want to give that power up. But none of us want to give up power. So I mean, it's not just then. Women want power, but they want power their way. So I don't know. I thought maybe we would come, Michael, to having a more equal society, a relationship between men and women, but I'm not so sure we.
Look, I mean, there's tremendous resistance to women being strong. I mean, you could see that when women try to run for, very high office or
right
things that aren't accepted. I mean, it's the things that you could get away with as a man, you could never get away with as a woman. You have to
right.
And men have to be strong or they can't get elected. When a candidate cried, I'm forgetting his name, it started with an M.
From Massachusetts, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But he cried, and
That was
for him. He cried for good reason, but unless you're a football player, you don't cry in public.
it. But you can lie and manipulate. And that seems still get elected.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
you know,
It's complex.
Yeah.
It's falling apart now, and the pushback is tremendous. I mean, I don't want to make this a political discussion, so I'm gonna be very careful not to go any farther in this direction. But you can almost see what's going on as a response to things like this, trying to hold on to old ways.
Walter
Absolutely.
Mondale.
Yes.
Walter Mondale. So if I could just maybe pivot a little bit. So what would you, for those of us who sometimes encounter when we're working with couples or individuals, women who are in these type of relationships, Lenore, what would you say? What do we do?
Well, I think
How do-
we're honest with our clients, our patients. We let them know that, because many women think that they can hide it. And for many, many years, they could, because we weren't training psychologists to recognize, pay attention to the power differences, coercive control. You know,
Gaslighting is a big thing everybody's talking about now.
That's the the most used new word, I guess, in
Yeah.
dictionary this year. So, but I think it's really important for people to understand that mental health professionals can see through a lot of what they're doing.
Yeah.
So we have to be honest and say, you know, right on the table, what you're describing to me sounds to me like you're being asked to do things that you don't want to do.
So many years ago, I was doing a consultation, initial couple session with a very prominent member in our community, and during the session, this person began to emotionally batter and abuse his wife right in the session, and it was pretty intense and powerful. And so I said, you need to stop your abusive behavior right now. And he stood up out of the seat and said, "Doctor, you are a quack." And he walked out of the room. And that was it. So I often think back to that case in terms of how I might have handled that differently, because obviously the operation was a success, but the patient died. I mean, I confronted the abuse, but I didn't have a client anymore, and maybe I could have not helped them. But what would you say about that particular experience from your
Well, I would
perspective?
say I would say that you can't do couples therapy with a couple where there's domestic violence. Because the minute you start, good couples therapy requires systems perspective. And the minute you start to tamper with that system, you are going to throw it all out of sync, and all the coping mechanisms that they have put in place not to kill each other are going to be wiped out, and you are going to be in dangerous territory.
Yeah.
Number one. Number two, if you are really dealing with somebody who has been abused over time and has developed PTSD or battered woman syndrome, there are some features of those psychological symptoms that include the inability to believe that they are safe. And so you've lost them. If you reach out in good couples therapy, sometimes you support the man, Sometimes you support the other person. And if you support the man, she will never trust you again. Because she does not have the ability, if she has trauma and PTSD, she doesn't have the ability to perceive neutrality. And
yeah, okay, that's interesting. So what would you say, how would you delineate between battered women syndrome and PTSD? Like how are they different, and how do they overlap?
they're the same, basically. Battered woman syndrome has some additional features. The research that we've done, in addition to the criteria that are used for PTSD, battered women syndrome also have 4 other areas. I don't know if you want me to get into all the details.
Yes, yeah. Why don't you?
Let me just say one thing about this particular topic, because I think you've written about this, and I at least I recall you reading it, that it's not just abuse of women. There's tremendous abuse of the children, and many of the men learn to be abusers from being abused.
Absolutely, yeah.
So obviously, if you call the guy out, he's going to react in his defensive style and attack you and call you a quack, and that's that. Or he'll make it clear that, even non-verbally, that when they leave there, some bad stuff is going to happen. So
right.
Approaching it from the perspective of that there's a lot of people who get abused or who are in difficult situations. And, if you had your kid come home from school saying that they had been abused, any kind of abuse, doesn't matter, by somebody at the school, how would you feel? So try getting them to talk about their wish to protect their child and to abandon the abuser role, and then introduce, how do you protect people when they're being abused, and how would you do it? So they can be a hero and protect, and begin to alter their behavior from that perspective.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with how to work with the men. So I don't know if that would work or not. But what I would do with the situation that Jeff has talked about is, I would say that couples therapy, we can no longer do couples therapy before he quit.
So you would have fired him first.
I would have fired him first, and I would have said, and I've done it. And it's very interesting what happens. I'll tell you, in one case that I worked on, my office was set up where I had 2 sofas and a chair and a table like in the middle. And we're talking about something, and this man stood up. He got so angry at something that was being said that he took the table in the middle and kicked it like across the room. And I was like stunned. This is early days. And I said to him, I guess you're very angry. It was like sort of mirroring his emotion. And he looked at me and said, "What makes you say that?" He had no understanding of his own emotions.
No.
And that's.
So it wasn't even conscious.
No, he was not even conscious of it. And I said, well, that's exactly why we're going to have to split this up. And I'll work with one of you and get a therapist for the other one. And he said, good, I'm going to work with you. I said, no, I don't know how to work well with men. I work better with women. And he said to me, no, that's not fair. So,
That's good. See, it's
you know, I
you
mean,
like unfairness, so what would be a fair way?
yeah, absolutely. And so, in that particular couple, I kept him as my client, and we struggled through it, and I referred her to somebody else. And eventually the couple did split up, because he could not control he couldn't even feel his anger until it was like, an explosion. And that's what I had to do with him, was to teach him to feel his anger as it would begin to manifest itself, so that it didn't get to those proportions. And I think that's very true for a lot of people, especially men who have been abused, is that they learn to shut down those feelings when they're young, when they're children. And that's part of what we have to do. We have to stop the behavior, but we also have to work. A cognitive behavior therapy works, but it's not enough. We have to add, and that's the kind of theory that I've now developed with the treatment program. We have the survivor therapy empowerment program that's working pretty well for men as well as for women, where we're teaching them relationship issues as well as working with cognitive behavioral stuff, but we always start with the cognitive behavioral stuff first, because that's what is easier and less explosive in your office.
So I've been working
going back and forth. Yeah.
I've been working on a module this week on emotional regulation. And would you say that most men who are batterers have issues with emotional dysregulation?
Yes, I would say that. And I think many women do as well.
Many women do. And do you think that they kind of trigger one another?
I think it's different, but I don't know that I'd say they trigger one another, but it's possible. I think each relationship, you have to look at how they handle their emotions, how they handle power and control issues, how they handle when their emotions start to get out of control. And
so
what's going on in their thinking, what's going on cognitively. And so you got to do that analysis for every person that you work with.
But I want to put a pin here. Is power and control sort of the main themes in relationships where there's battering? Is that I've heard you say power and control a number of times. Do you feel like that's sort of the main dynamic?
I think it's one of the main dynamics. It's not the only one, but it's one of the main dynamics.
Yeah.
Because emotional dysregulation is less of a theme, it's more of how people have evolved over their developmental journey to either be able to emotionally regulate or not. But the power and control themes seem very complex and have multiple influences: cultural, ethnic, social, familial. I mean, it just seems almost overwhelming to think about all the converging forces that operate in those domains.
Well, that's true, but at the same time, there has to be the explanation of why is it that so many men use the violence and aggression, and so many women use it less. Not that they don't use it, but it's different and they use it less likely. I just finished editing a special issue of the Journal of Aggression, Maltreatment and Trauma on women who kill. Fascinating when you look at that extreme. And for the most part, the women who kill are women who have been abused at some point in their life. Most of them, many of them, both as kids and as adults.
But that'd be the case for a lot of women. That's not necessarily predictive, because
No, I didn't say it's
Women.
statistics, but
So what distinguishes the women that kill from the women who have been abused and don't kill?
we don't know. But it's generally, in a large number of the cases, it is being in a situation where they believe they're going to die. And so it's a self-defense mechanism. Now, sometimes you can't see why they would think that, but that's a feature of PTSD, is that when a new incident happens, fragments of the old incidents come up in the woman's head. And so she may not even recognize the difference or be able to take apart what came from different abuse incidents and what's triggering her from this incident. So those are fascinating cases. We've done almost 400 of those cases now.
400. That's remarkable.
Well, it's a long career. If you know, President Biden just pardoned the second case that I did back in 1978, I think it was.
Wow.
Beverly Eben Tomas, a wonderful woman from DC, and that's how I got involved in testifying in these cases, because I got up at a program at the University of Washington on gender violence, and somebody asked me a question, and I said, well, you know, we have to change the social order between men and women, because that's what's feeding domestic violence. And they said to me, well, we can't wait that long. Women are dying every day. And I said, well, then if a woman has to kill them in self-defense so they don't die, I'll help the defense, you know, figure out a defense for them.
Yeah.
I had been in court twice, once to pay a traffic ticket and once for a divorce at that point. I didn't know what I was saying. And I also was so naive, I didn't know that there were reporters in that audience.
Oh my goodness.
And all of a sudden, the headlines were, noted psychologists will defend battered women who kill.
By killing herself, helping them, assisting. So Barbara, I see Barbara, you've joined us. I want to hear from you, Barb.
Yes, I'm sorry I'm late, but I've been following the conversation and it's wonderful. So just picking up your theme, because I'm someone who loves to watch, you know, courtroom dramas on TV and all that. Do you have an opinion about whether the battered woman, defense is being overused or misused or dishonestly used in certain cases?
No, I don't think so. And maybe, you know, there's a case or two that happens like anything else. But for the most part, putting together a battered woman defense is really a difficult job. Most attorneys don't want to bother. And many women who honestly should have been using it are languishing in prison.
Oh, it's terrible.
Which is, you know, very sad. So I think, though, that we're getting more and more complex cases, because the easy cases that really look like self-defense, prosecutors are not going as viciously. But at the same time, the ones that are the most difficult to defend are the women who kill children, or the women who don't kill the child, but who fail to protect them, and the abuser who abuses them and abuses the child. And I have a number of death cases where the men who did the actual killing get a plea for life in prison, and the woman gets the charged with death, capital case.
Oh my God, that's horrible.
You know, I've got one going on for 11 years in Arizona. It's remarkable.
Now, is that part of the patriarchy that keeps? Is it just
Yep,
a
that's our
manifestation?
That's
a
our job.
manifestation
We're
of the
gonna have
patriarchy
to-
that
Right, we
because
have to protect the child even when we can't even protect ourselves.
when sometimes when I read about these cases, I am appalled that they're even prosecuted. Like women who have been held hostage and horrifically abused, when they finally kill the abuser, they are charged with murder. I am appalled sometimes, oftentimes.
Yes,
Why does that happen, Lenore?
because women that women are still not seen as individuals and understood very well. You know, I mean, I still think that the legal system hasn't caught up with where we were. I thought we were making progress until this past year, when we lost the right to control our own bodies. And I live in a state where the governor thinks that freedom, he calls it the freedom state, but he's taken away my freedoms. And they don't get it.
Well, there's-
I know you didn't want to get into politics, Michael, but
We can
Yeah,
converge. We converge.
there's many.
We don't have any corporate sponsors, so we can go where we need to go.
The issue over and over here is that there's kind of denial, there's blindness, there's all kinds of motivations, power, and yet you've got, as the dean said, these people with all this power are dying younger. They're destroying their world. So how, I don't think you couldn't go on head to head with this guy in the couples therapy who gets up and calls you a quack or threatens to smash you with something. I think that the making people aware of how much trauma there is, and I think not celebrating the trauma, because a lot of people get off on these terribly aggressive, destructive shows, but there's a lot more attention on television with series where people are being portrayed as abused. Many more times you're seeing people begin to recognize just how difficult it is. And the more we focus not on who's bad, but how abused people are, because you've got huge suffering masses of people. You've got classes that are abused. It's not just, and naturally, it makes people very angry, and they use what defenses they have available. So they're going to be abusive back or threaten everyone. And without recognizing just how much abuse there is and talking about it, people aren't going to be sensitized to it. And that's why I think the back door works a little better on it, talking about the abused child or the abused pet or something, because people are much more willing to get in touch, not with their anger, but with their sympathy for them and their wish to help them. And then they can begin to see that some of these behaviors are theirs too. But it's without having this collision, which disrupts the whole relationship. I'm not saying that you're going to save marriages that way, but I'm saying if it disrupts the therapy, like the man, say, I would differ with you with the guy who's there and he can't be treated in the room. I think he needs to be recognized as someone who knows how to be angry and he can be blind to his anger, but doesn't really talk about how he suffered.
The treatment that has been the most successful in terms of the research on the men has been them in group therapy, not with one psychologist or one therapist, but with a group of 8 to 10 of the other men, where that's where they can talk about what they need to talk about, but also call out the men that are in denial, and call out
Huh.
the
Mhm.
Uh-huh.
like my guy who didn't recognize his own feelings,
Mhm.
because they will accept it better from their peers
Sure, sure.
than they accept it from us as quacks or whatever, you know.
So-
And
Oh,
they
look,
can push it
we're
away.
always quacks if we take a position which is
So-
one good. and one
So,
is
yeah, so,
But how, there are a lot, but that idea that you've got to find a way to
but
get.
that's the
the-
way that it has been the best. Even so, the very best therapy for the men that's been studied shows that about 50% of them stop their physical abuse, but not their psychological abuse.
Mhm.
And in many of them, they become better at psychological abuse.
Oh,
Um,
that's
Which-
disturbing.
which is a problem. You
What do
know?
you make out of that?
Well, it means that we don't know what we're doing yet.
Oh, wow.
You know, that's what it means. It means we haven't,
Well,
we because who's doing that work, but very much the same people who have been exposed to the same culture. And so we have to find a
right.
way to break through that. And I say 50% is better than 0. So I'm not unhappy with that. I'm just saying it's not enough. We need to do more work with that. And more recently, I was reading on the Division 51 listserv, you know, some guys that are now jumping on saying, well, men are abused as much as women. Well,
Sure.
you know, and I'm sure we've all heard that for many
Well,
years.
let's have them talk about how they were abused publicly.
And they want to talk about how they're the ones who have been.
But not how, talk about how they've been the ones, but the granular description of what it was like for them.
And I want to say one other thing, though, that all the data show that we're making a mistake to think that all men who abuse women are the same. There's some good research that was done by, oh, I'm blocking our names, but Neil Jacobson at a long time ago, back before he passed away, and he showed that there were different kinds of mechanisms, psychological mechanisms going on in these men that he was examining. And he did some fascinating work by putting skin measures and heart rate measures in addition to what they were saying cognitively, and found that there were some batterers whose heart rate slowed, and he called it cold anger. I mean, we've all seen people.
The cobra.
Mhm.
That's right. It was exactly the pit bulls and the cobras, and that was
Yep.
the cobra. When you're working with a cobra, you are not going to work with them the same way as you will with a pit bull who's exploding. I mean, even if you didn't have that research, we would know, good clinicians would
Yeah,
know
yeah.
that. So we talk about batteries as if they are a unified group, but they're not. And so again, we need more. I would encourage much more research on that. And that's part of, you asked me a question, I think, Jeffrey, earlier, is why such a pushback from women? And I think one of the reasons is that we treat all the women the same too. And they're not at all the same. That there's all kinds of intersectionality going on. And so we are gonna, it's like an onion, you know, that you're peeling back. We have to peel it back and have a general framework of what we're doing, but still adapt it to each therapist and each client. You know, I like Norcross and
I
his,
have a question.
There's a you know, if you look at this from the perspective of this guy who's, you know, tough guy, or and you don't know too much about him, and he's really, you know, you're talking to him and you're a smart guy or a smart woman, professional, and you don't know it, but as you're talking to him, he's feeling put down because of the way you talk. I had this experience repeatedly where someone says to me, you know, who's the nastiest, from my perspective, nasty and threatening and trying to get me really to run away. I mean, he just tried, you know, it's like throwing a tarantula at me while we're sitting there. And sometimes they say, you know, you're never going to get anywhere talking to me that way. And I'm thinking, I'm just talking to him such a gentle way. And he says, you want me to swallow that ice box? Well, why don't you can't talk to me that way and get me to see anything. You have to get me one step removed. You can talk about a friend of mine, but there's no way that if you take that position, and they demonstrate that if I don't drop down to a position where he can hear it, in a way he can hear it, he's not going to move. In other words, they need to hear things differently than you would need to or I would need to, because the very manner of being talked to that way is an insult to them.
you know, a lot of these guys don't appear to be strong guys. Some of them, you're shocked that they're so abusive and so cruel. You know, so we have to be careful.
Well, I think one of the things that we learn clinically is a lot of these fellows have fragile ego structures, incredibly fragile ego structures that's compensated for by hypermasculinity and machismo, but the ego structure is extremely fragile, and they're like
How come we're talking about men?
well.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Even though I've said, I mean, I can speculate with everything, but my work has been with helping women heal.
That's a good question. So let's see if we can answer that one. Why did we shift to talking about men?
Yeah.
Because you didn't let me jump in with a question. That's why.
No, actually, because you
Go ahead.
Well,
your video.
my question, I know we're almost running out of time, is kind of asking Lenore, I'm thinking just of tips for a therapist, or, you know, kind of, we supervise students, beginning therapists, but they're working, a new female client has come in, and the person just talks vaguely, oh, I'm depressed. And they say, oh, my husband's critical. Like, what are some tips for conducting the interview? And does it take a long time to build trust? But how do you get the details, concrete details of what's happening?
I ask straight out.
Like, is he hitting you, or that?
Yeah, when he's very critical, does his facial features change? Do you get scared sometimes? What are those times when you're feeling scared? And I might go on, depending on the person. Do you think that you're being abused? And
unfortunately, on that note, we're gonna have to wrap up our
Thank you.
formal part of the session. So
You got one.
we'll do it in the follow-up. We have to stick to the hour. Dr. Walker, thank you so much for joining us. And for those who are watching, we're gonna stop the recording, but we're gonna continue to discuss
And
some of these fascinating questions.
read my murder mysteries.
Yeah, I did, and we'll talk more about that.
I
So
did,
hang around,
I did read one.
hang around, and thank you all. We'll see you next month for our next Eminent Psychotherapists Revealed interview. Thank you very much for joining us. Bye now.